Hey, class, and welcome to our reading of Chapter 8 of The Call of the Wild. Just a quick disclaimer that we do have on page 165. It talks about Buck getting a guy by the throat, and the doctor stopped the bleeding. It's one page, very minimal. That's about it. This is a really good chapter as far as positivity and just learning more about Buck. So, not a big disclaimer. All right, let's get started. This is a long chapter, so just sit back and remember you can rewatch this video as many times as you need to review the information for chapter 8. For the love of a man. John Thornton's feet had been frozen in December. His partners had left him to get well. He and Buck spent the days lying by the riverbank. Buck's strength returned. John had two other dogs named Skeet and Blackie. They were all resting. They were waiting for the raft to come and carry them to Dawson. Buck, Skeet, and Blackie quickly became friends. John Thornton was a kind man. For the first time in his life, Buck felt love. He had felt friendship toward Judge Miller, but with John Thornton, it was real love. John Thornton was the perfect master. He treated his dogs like children. He would hold Buck's head in his hands. He'd put his head against Buck's. He would shake the big dog playfully. He would use names that made Buck feel loved. Buck was happy when Thornton touched or spoke to him. He would lie for hours at his master's feet. Buck did not like Thornton to be out of his sight. He would follow him everywhere. Buck was afraid of losing him. He had lost so many masters. The Northlands changed Buck. He became aware of wild feelings. He had learned the harsh law of club and fang. He knew that he had to kill or be killed. A strange call often sounded from the forest. Buck needed to follow it, but his love for John Thornton always drew him back. One day, Thornton's partners arrived on the raft. They all traveled to Dawson. Hans and Pete could see Buck's love for Thornton. Pete said, "I'd hate to be the man who lays hands on you when Buck's around." Later that year, Pete's warning came true. A man named Burton picked a fight with another man at a bar. Thornton stepped between them. Buck was watching. Burton hit Thornton. Buck roared. His body rose up in the air. He got Burton by the throat. He tore it open. A doctor was able to stop the bleeding. The people decided Buck had done what he had to. They let him go. Buck's name quickly spread through every mining camp in Alaska. That fall, Buck saved Thornton's life again. They were boating on a wild stretch of rapids. The boat turned over. Thornton was flung out of it. He was carried downstream. Buck jumped into the swirling water. Thornton grabbed his tail, and Buck headed for the bank. Thornton grabbed a rock. He let go of Buck. Go, Buck, go, he yelled, and Buck was able to swim to shore. Pete and Hans tied a rope around him, and Buck jumped back into the water. He swam to Thornton. The man put his arms around him. Pete and Hans pulled them to shore. Thornton went over Buck's body, and he found 3 broken ribs. We will camp here until Buck is able to travel, Thornton said. That winter, Buck became famous for another reason. The partners wanted to search for a lost mine, but they didn't have enough money. In a bar, they got to talking. Other miners were bragging about their dogs. One man said his dog could start a sled with 700 pounds on it. John Thornton said, Buck can start a sled with 1,000 pounds. He can break it out of the ice. Then he'll pull it for 100 yards. I've got $1,000 that says he can't, a man said. He put the money down on the bar. Thornton had been bluffing. He didn't know if Buck could really do that, but soon the bet was made. Others got in on the betting action. The man's sled was loaded with 1,000 pounds of flour. The sled's runners were frozen to the hard packed snow. Buck was hitched to the sled. He had caught the excitement. He knew he must do this for John Thornton. Thornton knelt by Buck's side and he took his head between both hands. He whispered, As you love me, Buck. And then he stepped back. He said, Now, Buck. Buck tightened the traces. Then he let them go a little. This was the way he had learned. Gee, Thornton's voice rang out, and Buck swung to the right. The load shook. Haw, Thornton shouted. Buck moved to the left. The sled broke free. Now mush! Buck threw himself forward. His muscles strained. His feet flew. The sled swayed. Then it moved slowly forward. It gained speed and moved steadily along. Men gasped. Thornton was running behind. He cheered Buck on. He passed the 100-yard marker. Men cheered. They threw their hats into the air, and Thornton fell on his knees beside Buck. He hugged him, and tears were streaming down his face. And that is the end of chapter 8.